Hi, I'm Jason Gorber for ThatShelf.com, and we're here to talk about The Batman.
Big shelf.
So this is another Batman movie. We've gone through a bunch of them. And look, comic book movies are sort of keeping Hollywood alive in some funny ways. You're seeing a real divide. Again, it's the sort of sports team or video game console or whatever it is. It's been there since the beginning, frankly, with modern comic book films between the DC universe and the Marvel universe. And the Marvel stuff has definitely financially done pretty remarkable box office stuff. But just in terms of storyline, the Marvels have been doing this really sort of convoluted world building, but doing so with a certain level of fun and sort of frivolity. And I think it's fair to say that, especially under some of the Zack Snyder stewardship, you've seen a very dark, very brooding, almost adolescent a vision of the way that these comic books work. My introduction to Batman was absolutely the Adam West, the sort of zany, really colorful, really broad. But of course, the real introduction to Batman was Detective Comics. This very noir character with this undercurrent of real menace at play. This was an orphan whose parents were killed in front of him, after all. So there was always this sort of psychological brooding quality that's been at play, frankly, in most of the cinematic visions of Batman. 1989's Tim Burton film was perfect. I was in high school. It was a perfect time for it to come out. Absolutely astonishing. Really my introduction to Jack Nicholson, of all things. And it was wild to have this sort of actor who I knew as this sort of comedic guy playing this sort of suave Bruce Wayne and this very aesthetic vision of Batman, a very extremely gothic, extremely drawn figure. Quite remarkable. We saw through the Schumacher years bring in, frankly, some of the kinkiness. We'd seen that obviously with Catwoman and Michelle Pfeiffer and absolutely going the full-on S&M route of her costume. But by the time we get to Bat Nipples, where you got Schumacher really diving into the sort of weird fetishization of the embracing of the outfit, of the dressing up to play the part kind of thing. Again, a really interesting take on this character. What the fundamental point is this: is that you have with some of these iconic characters the same way you do with somebody like Arthur, King Arthur, or frankly religious stories, or any iconic myths of a canvas by which you can tell other versions of the same story. And I'm always excited about that theme of variation, about that there is no single Batman, there is no single story of the deflator mouse that we're going to sort of hold on to, saying this is the one, this is the definitive one. Surely every comic fan knows that the sort of reinvention, regeneration of these characters over and over again sort of plays out. The Christopher Nolan ones really struck a chord internationally, obviously, and for me, just visually, they're just incredibly stunning. It's funny how they've aged. They really sort of set the bar for what taking seriously this kind of film, especially Dark Knight. Of taking some of that intensity of the character and twisting it, taking all the other stuff that was taking place with cinema at the time. James Bond was getting darker. Jason Bourne had sort of led into a very specific way of doing fighting. It took that whole notion that you could hurt Bruce Wayne by hurting Batman and all of that dynamic. Actually, one of the things I love about that Batman series is the moment where you actually have people pretending to be Batman and getting their shit kicked out of them. The whole notion of people sort of using social media and glomming onto it. We've seen the Suicide Squad vision of Joker sort of tying into that. That's where the Ben Affleck version came in some of the Justice League stuff. And originally, Ben Affleck was meant to be part of this film, The Batman. This was going to be written, directed, and starring Ben Affleck. It was going to be a slightly beaten down vision of the man who's been fighting for so long and not necessarily seeing the effects that he had wanted to. The sort of old drunk middle-aged Batman, which is still, I think, an interesting way of taking the story. So what happens when you've lost everything? What are you still actually fighting for? But instead, after long convoluted stuff, Ben Affleck going off to rehab, etc., you got Matt Reeves, who again took a story that had been told before, the Planet of the Apes films, and really made them his own. Again, a very interesting film director, and somebody who's has a great deal of capacity to take something that's massive and make it very intimate. And one thing I think he does really, really well here is he basically sets the world of Batman a year after Batman started being Batman. Of having the decision as a young man to go ahead and become this mass vigilante. And he's still uncertain about it. Things haven't quite worked out with it. And it's nice to see. But really what he's done is he's doubled down on the whole notion of it being a detective comic. It really feels more like something like Zodiac than it does something like an Avengers film. And for me, that's a really good thing. The fact that it sort of gets away with being a PG-13 film is actually also kind of remarkable, because there's a great deal of intensity here. This is a Batman. This is not fucking around being Batman. There's a dripping darkness, like a psychological darkness to it, a madness to both the impetus to be the vigilante and also those people that are reacting against him. You have Paul Dano, who's playing ostensibly a character who's a Riddler, and the dynamic between the two of them really feels, again, something of the ilk of Silence of the Lambs, almost like hunting a serial killer, hunting something like that. Now, again, the Nolan films touched upon that, the sociopathy of the Joker and the mirroring between the Joker and Batman, I think was done extremely effectively in those series. This is done again, theme and variation, but this is very much his own film. Aesthetically, it's his own film. Musically, it's his own film. Michael Giacchino's score is fantastic. It's really stripped down. It's the anti Hans Zimmer in some ways. In fact, over the title crawl, you have a solo classical piano part. It's very austere in some ways. It's stripped back, and when it works, it really, really works. Jeffrey Wright's fantastic. You have a whole bunch of people under tons of prosthetic makeup. They're unrecognizable. Colin Farrell in particular. A big meme about whether or not, why didn't they just get Richard Kind instead of getting Steve Carell? Colin Farrell. Where did Steve Carell come from? Colin Farrell to wear all the makeup. You have a bunch of other great character actors at play, but a real showcase here for Zoe Kravitz. Now, we've seen Zoe Kravitz before. We saw her, in Fury Road, for God's sakes, one of the greatest films ever made. But she really, it's one of those things. It's like, that she's going to hit a lot of notes. We've seen everybody from Eartha Kitt all the way up, do Catwoman, as this very specifically seductive and fetishized character. Somebody who can get under Batman's skin and do so with a sort of slinkiness, a catness, as it were. Not the other catness, that's a whole nother series, but like a catnishness to her felinity, to quote T.S. Eliot. What's really remarkable, I think, about Zoe Kravitz's character, she takes another aspect, very feline aspect, which is the aloofness is more weaponized because it's a generally not giving a shit what you think. It is not to be mean, it's you are now in my way of whatever it is I gotta do, and I've already forgotten about you once I've turned my back to you. And she's fantastic about that. Even the way the costume's actually designed, sort of, she obviously plays this incredibly beautiful vision of this character. They shoot her in a way which is very elegant and very appealing, of course, because that's the kind of character, but it's not done in a way that's sort of, for lack of a better word, is kinky. It doesn't have that aspect. Even when she's wearing the mask and doing the stuff, it feels very much part of the universe. That in some ways, Batman himself is a much more of a fetish figure, is much more of a kinky thing. And then you look at other sort of iconic elements of the storytelling. If you look at how the Batmobile is built, it essentially looks like a Mustang. It looks like a Neo Ford Mustang. and the car, I guess, is a Mustang that Bruce Wayne actually drives, his vintage car. It's a very angular vehicle, and we've seen everything from the giant, the elongated penises of the Schumacher era, to the battle tanks of Christopher Nolan. This is the let's fuck with a car and make it into a Batmobile, so it's not so over the top that it almost makes it all somewhat believable. Now, the issue with being so sort of on the nose with believability is then you start questioning everything. So for the first hour and a bit, it's long, 220, 230. But when you are sort of going along for the first build up, you're absolutely there with it. But once it sort of turns into a comic book movie and you start seeing, people swinging from things and water flooding in the cities, because you spent so much time thinking about the reality of the situation, you almost sort of get distracted by what's going to happen to floodwaters? Why is the electricity still on? Why is this happening? In other words, the suspension of disbelief has been stripped away for you to find real intensity in the characters. And then when it's required, inevitably, because it's a comic book movie, it's sort of off-putting. It doesn't quite nail that. And I think that the last half of the film really suffers from not navigating that balance between something that was absolutely set as almost a documentary of the investigation work of somebody like a Batman, and at the end where it just basically becomes a whole bunch of people fighting and a whole bunch of weird politics surrounding it. So I think it's really interesting. I look forward to seeing it again. I was surprised, actually, in IMAX, it does not do any multiple aspect ratios. It looked great, but it's sort of stuck with a standard aspect ratio. It didn't take advantage of any of the things that IMAX films tend to do to actually open up to the 1:3:1 aspect. Doesn't do that. But again, sonically, I think the score is fantastic. And it comes down to the fact is, how is Robert Pattinson? Inevitably, I think he's a better Batman than he is Bruce Wayne. I think they really... I would have liked, as long as it is, I would have liked another 25 minutes of him as Bruce Wayne. And dynamic, especially with somebody who we all know is so remarkable. But the dynamic that you actually have with Andy Serkis as Alfred, it's just, there's clearly this father figure dynamic at play, which is really crammed in because they got to get to all these sort of explosions and stuff like that. But it's almost like I would have liked about a 45-minute sequence of just them dealing with the psychology of both these two wounded people, and the way that sort of played out. I know that would not have done well financially, but it's one of those things. It's like, what do I miss from this film? It's not the stuff in the second half, it's the stuff in the first half. I would have liked more of that deep, rich character stuff that for me really made it much more cinematically interesting, as opposed to just another, comic book bit of fluff, a summer film here in February, as it were. So I think the Batman is definitely worth seeing. I think a lot of people are going to be find it really dour and really sort of joyless. I think other people will find it perfectly dark and perfectly in keeping with Batman. I think a lot of people will say, well, I missed the sort of the bombast of some of the other comic book films. I don't care. As ridiculous as it is, I don't care financially how it does. In the real sort of stark way of saying that is, I'm less concerned about how this will connect with general audiences. I think there's very much an audience for this film. I think people who will love this film will lose their minds for this film. I think this is the one they've been in some ways waiting for many, many years, to actually deal with the character in this way. And for them, congratulations, you got the movie that 100% works for you. For me, it's like, it's not quite 50-50, but for me, it's like when it works, it really works. I really love some of those elements. And again, I would have loved an R-rated version, not because of violence, but because of just the dynamic at play. Just the getting really into the darkness is something that, as, almost 50-year-old dude, I respond more. If I would have seen this in high school, this movie really would have kicked my ass, just like the '89 one did. I will say there's a Nirvana song that they play twice, and again, anybody knows me knows my sort of dislike of Nevermind in particular. That's a whole nother conversation to have. If you really want, dig up my review of Montage of Heck, the incredible documentary about a band that I genuinely dislike. Anyway, the punchline of this is that there's a very somber Nirvana song that plays. It's actually in the trailer. It's a 2-chord song. So it's like, it's repetitive, it's morose. It definitely feeds into a very particular ennui, and it's super in keeping with what's going on with the character of Bruce Wayne. And it's that same kind of thing. It's like the 2 chords really works until you sort of get tired of hearing the same 2 chords again. You kind of want it to go somewhere. You want a little bit of complexity, but you appreciate its intensity. That kind of ambivalence, I think, is really very much at play with the way that the Batman works. So there you go. I look forward to hearing your responses. Let me know in the comments what you thought of the film. I'm Jason Gorber for thatshelf.com. Thanks so much for watching. Plenty more content here on the site. Please look at our reviews actually on the website and support us here on the video channel with a like, a comment, subscribe. It really helps us out a lot. I look forward to seeing you next video. All the best and take care. Have fun at the movies.